Well, this morning we heard David Aikman tell us something that we were all starting to experience, that this idea of Christian America, which I'd probably further define as this sense where the Christian ideas have really governed and ruled the public square, where people just assumed that the Judeo-Christian view of the world was in operation at all times in the public square, and those days are moving behind us. And then secondly, Tim Keller, as only Tim can do, painted a beautiful portrait of what's possible when we really embrace the gospel and understand how the gospel applies to every single area of our life, every single need. But it still begs a very important question that we must ask today, which is, how will we realize this vision of being Christians, of being faithful followers of Christ in a very post-Christian setting? How do we do this in a place where the church might not be regarded as highly as it once was, or where Christians definitely aren't viewed with as much respect as they would have been just a decade ago? What does mission look like in a new context that's definitely Western, but very unique, where it combines postmodernism, pluralism, and really this new attitude that's somewhat anti-Christian? You see, I look at that and I think we have one of the greatest opportunities in the world that lies ahead of us. I don't see this and get depressed or think, what are we going to do? I think God's started to map out this plan for us and that we're walking into it. That this isn't new information to him, but that he's been raising up a generation of people, that he's been guiding us, that he's been helping us better understand the world that we live in for this moment. And so over the last few years, one of the things we do with our organization is research. We're studying, we're interviewing people, we're meeting with people, we're convening focus groups. We're studying what's happening, especially within this 20 and 30-something generation. And I'm happy to tell you that there's so much hope. And I think each of you experience that. You experience it at your churches, you experience it in your faith communities, maybe in your small groups, maybe just with a few colleagues or friends that you meet up with every now and then. You're having these conversations. You're tuned in that something new's emerging, but you're not quite sure what it is. Maybe you haven't quite figured out how to describe it or how to talk about it. But this morning I'm going to attempt to fill you in on a few characteristics, a few things that might define for us a little bit of language and a little bit of understanding of what is happening, what is on the move, and what God might be doing through us, through Christians who are seeing the world in this way. And so first, I'd like to help you understand a little bit about the mentality that governs the people you're mostly going to see on this Q stage as they describe their stories. What you're going to find is these people aren't really offended when they run into this kind of corruption. When they see a world that's maybe messed up or frazzled or in need of redemption or renewal, instead of being offended, they're provoked. You see, they're provoked to engage. They don't just condemn the people that show up at their doorstep. They actually get in there with them and they help those people. They have a certain mentality that governs that, and it's rooted in the stories that come out of the Gospels. I mean, let's look at Jesus for a second. In Luke 19, when he meets Zacchaeus, who's looked at, obviously in that society, as one of the worst, the chief of sinners, so to speak, and he invites himself over to his home for dinner. Jesus didn't avoid that. He engaged him. He did one of the most intimate things you could do in that culture. And on we see Jesus with the woman at the well. Here's somebody where a Jewish rabbi should never speak to a woman who's alone, and yet he engages her. You see, it happens throughout as he heals lepers, as he heals a Roman centurion's son, because this centurion represents everything that the Jews hated about their society, and yet Jesus goes into someone just like that and engages with them. He meets people where they're at on their journey towards him, and he helps bring them one step closer. But this happens because they're provoked. And the Christians today in this generation, what we're seeing is they're provoked. They don't run away from the problems. They get in there with the problem. But it's not just that they're provoked to engage. It's really what they do when they show up. You see, when they show up, they don't just criticize the problem or just criticize how this problem came to be. They're not critics, but instead they're creators. Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, I think is very formative in helping us think about what does creation look like for us as Christians? Well, what does it look like in our world today? Well, we show up and we create things that solve systemic problems that could have caused the brokenness that showed up at our doorstep. You see, we think deeply about what's taking place, and we think deeply about how did this situation come to be, whether it's in a school system, or whether it's within a corporation in which you work, or whether it's in a little nonprofit that you've begun, or as an entrepreneur to solve some sort of problem or social ill. This mentality that you bring to it is you're going to create something. You're not just going to talk about what's wrong. You're going to do something. You're going to apply the gifts and the talents that God's given you to apply to that situation. And I think most excitingly, we're seeing a generation who's starting to recover this idea of calling. They're starting to understand vocation. That we don't just have jobs, we don't just look for a place to work so that we can get a paycheck or be employed. But we actually look at where we invest our time, our energy, our dollars, our experiences, our talents. And we bring this new mentality to it. We bring this idea that we're provoked in the midst of that. So if you're a business leader, you take that into the business meeting. You take it into the boardroom. And that might look like a Bible study over lunch, but more often than not, what it looks like is that you're changing some of the systems in how you operate. It might be your advertising campaigns. It might be the way that you're thinking about the next product that you're going to offer. And is this really a good thing for the world? Is this really good for people, or is this just another way to make a buck? And the gospel's being applied in that situation. You might be an artist who writes music, and you've decided to apply that talent throughout your community. You're showing up and you're playing in bars. You're playing out there in the world where people are being confronted with your songs, your lyrics. You're not scared of it. You're not hiding it inside the church. You're going out. And this is happening in every channel. I think if we could go around this room and we could hear your stories like Becky's and so many others, what we would find is in every channel of culture, there are leaders like you who are embracing this vision and applying it right where you are. And you know what's unique about Q? You know what's unique about the opportunity that the church has? Is that the church is the only channel out of all 7 that on a weekly basis is convening the other 6 channels. You see, historically, when we start to overlap these communities of people, these different skill sets, these different mindsets, these different places where mission is taking place, and we all come together occasionally like this, and this is happening weekly in your city, in your church, and we start to think this way and we start to support one another, can you imagine what is possible? You see, I think it's one of the greatest opportunities that we have. I think it's one of those dawning ideas that's going to come to bear over the next decade, is that the church will continue to better understand what it means to send their people into these channels of culture. No matter what it is that they're doing, equip them and disciple them with a mindset that causes them to show up wherever they've been called. And when they show up, they bring the gospel to bear on that situation. And yes, sometimes conversion happens as a result of that. But their first priority isn't to focus on that or to only put that first. It's to go in and have this both and view. That they're not only there to bring Christ to bear in their situation, but yeah, when the opportunities present themselves, they talk about Jesus. They're not ashamed of Jesus. They're not ashamed to be a Christian because they recognize that being a Christian has something very life-giving to offer to the world. But there's something important about this that we can't mistake. And that is in this world where we talk about culture engagement, and you hear some of these stories and they sound really good and they sound like, man, they're really mixing it up in some of the grit and grime of our world. Let's not be mistaken to think that we can do that without being deeply anchored in Christ. You see, it's in Christ that we have to find our rooting. It's in Christ that we have to immerse ourselves. We have to immerse ourselves in Scriptures, not run from it. We have to understand what God's telling us to do. We have to be intimate with Him. You know, these next Christians don't just show up and just engage in every single thing the world has to offer. They're actually grounded. They fast. One of the things we see is fasting for simplicity. Sometimes they're fasting from food. Sometimes they're fasting from technology. Sometimes they're fasting from consumption. But they have practices in their life that help them stay grounded. They understand that when they get out in the world and get tossed and turned every which way, that if they don't have this deep connection to Christ, that they'll be lost. And that much of what they've contributed and given their energy and time to could be lost. So we can't forget that. And that grounding only comes through discipleship. It only comes through groups of friends who help us go through these things together. But it best happens inside of a community. You see, we must have a community, the church coming around us. And so these next